My son-in-law thought he was dealing with a sentimental old man who couldn't see past his grief. He had no idea he was negotiating with someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning since the day he shook my hand at the rehearsal dinner and looked at my property, like he was already measuring it for something else. When my daughter stood in the orchard behind our farmhouse and married the man she loved, I made a quiet decision. I would not tell him, or her, not yet, that the land they were standing on was mine, all of it. Every acre, every tree, every structure, down to the old stone barn her grandfather built with his hands in 1948. I watched my son-in-law smile at the guests and raise his glass, and I kept my mouth shut. Thank God I did. My name is Holt. I am 67 years old. For 38 years, I worked this land alongside my wife, Beverly. Not Beverly from any file, not Beverly from any list, just my Beverly, the woman who could identify every apple variety on our property by the smell alone, who kept the books in green ledgers stacked on a shelf above the kitchen table, who died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in March while I was out pruning the back row of Honeycrisps. She was there when I went out. She was gone when I came back in for coffee. Before she passed, Beverly told me something I did not fully understand at the time. She said, "Holt, people will come for this place when I'm gone. Not strangers, people who think they have a right to it because they love someone who loves you." She squeezed my hand. She said, "Don't let them." I promised her I wouldn't. What I did not know was how fast the clock would start. Our daughter had been with her husband for 3 years before they got engaged. He worked in commercial real estate in Cincinnati, which meant he spent his days calculating what land was worth and how quickly it could be converted into something more profitable. He was charming. He wore good shoes. He remembered people's names and their kids' birthdays, and he always picked up the check at dinner. My daughter loved him completely and without reservation, the way she had always loved things, fully, without looking for the exit. I liked him fine, at first. The first time he came to the farm, he walked the perimeter before he came inside for dinner. I watched him from the kitchen window. He wasn't admiring the view. He was measuring something in his head. I could see it in how he moved, the way he paused at the fence line and turned slowly to take it all in. At dinner, he asked how many acres we were working. I told him we ran about 60 in active orchard and kept another 40 in woodlot and meadow along the creek. He nodded like I'd confirmed something he already suspected. He asked whether we sold direct to consumers or through a distributor. I said both. He asked whether the processing facility was on site. I said it was. My wife gave me a look across the table. Just a flicker. I saw it. I answered politely and told him we did all right. I did not tell him that the farm sat on 104 acres of land in one of the fastest appreciating rural counties in Ohio, now worth somewhere north of $2.5 million. I did not tell him that Beverly and I had diversified over the years, that we had a silent ownership stake in a regional cold storage cooperative, that we owned 2 rental properties outright in the nearest town, that our estate had been structured carefully by our attorney over a period of 15 years. I did not tell him any of that. Something about the way he walked that fence line told me not to. They got married in September, under the old maple at the edge of the east orchard. It was a beautiful day. My daughter cried at the altar. I cried too, though I hid it behind my handkerchief. Beverly would have loved it. She would have been standing right next to me. At the reception, my son-in-law found me by the barn. He had a beer in his hand and that easy, confident smile he wore like a uniform. He said, "I have to tell you, every time I come here I fall more in love with this place." I said I was glad. He said, "Have you ever thought about what you want to do with it long term? You know, with Beverly gone, it's a lot to manage alone." I told him I managed fine. He said, of course, I just mean, down the road. It might make sense to think about a transition plan." I took a sip of my drink. I said, "I've thought about it." He waited for more. I didn't give him more. He laughed and clapped me on the shoulder and said we'd talk sometime. There was nothing casual about it. His eyes stayed focused even when the rest of him was relaxed. I saw the calculation behind the friendliness. He wanted the farm. I understood that before the wedding cake was cut. 3 months after the wedding, my daughter called me. She said she and her husband had been talking. She sounded careful in the way she gets when someone else has written her script. She said they were worried about me. She said running the farm alone, at my age, might be more than I should take on. I asked what she was suggesting. She said, hesitantly, that her husband had some ideas about a management structure. He knew some people, investors who worked with family farms, people who could take on the operational burden while preserving the family's connection to the land. She said the word connection, like it was doing a lot of heavy lifting. I told her I would think about it. I did not sleep well that night, not because I was afraid, because I recognized what was happening. Beverly had warned me. I had made her a promise. I was going to keep it. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Crandall. He had handled Beverly's estate, and he knew every layer of our financial situation. I told him what my son-in-law had said and what my daughter had relayed. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Nothing has changed on paper, Holt. The farm, the rentals, the co-op stake, all of it is in the revocable trust, you as sole trustee. Your daughter isn't named as a beneficiary until you say so." I said, "Good. Don't change anything." He said, "Is everything all right?" I said, "It will be." Over the following months, my son-in-law started coming to the farm more often, not with my daughter sometimes, alone or with other men I didn't recognize. He would walk the property and take photographs on his phone. Once I watched him from the hayloft as he stood at the southwest corner of the orchard with another man who wore a sport coat and carried a portfolio. They talked for 20 minutes. Neither of them came to the house. When I asked my son-in-law about it later, he said he'd just been showing a friend around. He said the friend was in agriculture. I nodded and said nothing. I started keeping a record. Dates, times, what I observed, who was present. I wrote it in a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer. In November, my daughter and her husband came to Sunday dinner. He was different that evening. More direct. He said he'd done some research, and he wanted to share what he'd found. He opened his laptop on my kitchen table and walked me through what he called a transition scenario. He'd had someone value the farm. The number he quoted was real. He'd done his homework. But it was about 60% of what the property was actually worth, and it didn't account for the cooperative stake or the rental income at all. He said, if you sold to a land trust or conservation buyer, you could walk away with a significant sum and stay on as a resident manager, completely hands-off until you chose otherwise. I looked at my daughter. She was watching her plate. I said, "Who did you have appraise the property?" He said a firm he worked with in Columbus. I said I'd want a second opinion. He said that was completely fair and smiled like I'd said something amusing. He said, "Of course, we're not rushing anything. We just want you to know the options are there." My daughter looked up. She said, "Dad, we love you. We just want you to have a plan." I said I had one. The room got quiet. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table where Beverly used to do the books. I could almost see her green ledger on the shelf. I thought about what she had said, about people coming for the place. I thought it about my daughter, who I loved more than anything on this earth and who I believed loved me back, but who had somehow allowed herself to become a vehicle for someone else's ambitions. I decided to wait, and to watch, and to set a trap. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I did not deceive my son-in-law about anything material. What I did was give him access to an incomplete picture and let him assume the frame was the whole painting. He had asked to see our operation in detail, the yield records, the distributor contracts, the equipment inventory. I let him look. I showed him a clean, accurate version of our core apple business. Profitable but modest, the kind of numbers that supported the idea of a tired old farmer who might benefit from cashing out. I did not show him the cooperative documents or the rental property accounts. I did not show him the investment trust Beverly and I had been building quietly since our 30s. He thought he was looking at a farm worth a comfortable amount. He had no idea he was looking at an estate worth just under $4 million. I let him keep thinking that. In January, things escalated. My son-in-law called me to say he'd been speaking with a development group based out of Columbus. He said they had significant interest in the property, not just the farmland, but the whole parcel including the woodlot and the creek corridor. He said they were prepared to move quickly. He used the phrase time-sensitive opportunity twice in 5 minutes. I asked what his involvement with this group was. He paused. Then he said he had facilitated the introduction, as a courtesy, as family. I said I would think about it. That same week, my daughter called to say she thought I should speak with someone, a geriatric care consultant. She said a colleague of her husband's knew someone who could come to the house and do an assessment. to make sure I was managing all right, to give the family peace of mind. I said, "What kind of assessment?" She said it was routine, cognitive, physical, basic functioning. She said a lot of people my age found it reassuring. I am 67 years old. I run 6 miles a week. I do the New York Times crossword in pen. I can tell you the yield per acre for every block of our orchard going back 22 years. I said, "Sure, send them over." The consultant came on a Thursday morning, a woman with a clipboard and a professional manner. I made her coffee. I showed her around the house. I answered her questions clearly and without any sign of strain. She tested my memory, my reasoning, my processing speed. I passed everything without difficulty. Before she left, she said, "Mr. Holt, you seem completely sharp. I'm not sure why this referral was made." I thanked her and walked her to her car. 2 days later, my son-in-law called and asked how the assessment had gone. I told him it had gone well. He said he was glad. Then he said he had the development group's formal offer ready, and he wanted to bring it over that weekend. He said my daughter would be there. He said they could go through it together as a family. I said, "Bring it over." That Saturday they came. My son-in-law had a folder. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, where Beverly used to sit, and he laid out the offer. It was real money. It was also about half of what the property was worth, if you knew what you were looking at, which he did not, because I had made sure he didn't. He said, "I know this feels like a big step, but honestly, Holt, at your age, this could set you up completely for the rest of your life. At your age." He said that twice. The second time I wrote it in the notebook in my head. My daughter said, "Dad, I know this is hard, but we just want what's best for you." I looked at my daughter. She meant it. I believe she truly meant it. That was the hardest part of all of this. She wasn't being dishonest. She had just been slowly convinced by someone she trusted that I needed to be managed, and she'd let that convince her too. I picked up the folder. I looked at it for a long moment. My son-in-law leaned forward slightly. My daughter held very still. I set the folder down. I said, "Beverly used to have a rule about any document that came to this table." My son-in-law said, "What's that?" I said, "She never signed anything without sleeping on it twice and having Crandall look it over first." My daughter said, "That seems reasonable, Dad." My son-in-law's expression shifted, just a fraction. He said, "Of course, absolutely, this isn't a pressure situation." I said, "Good. Then you won't mind if I have Crandall take a look before we go any further?" He said he didn't mind at all. He said that was very sensible. He said it with a smile that didn't quite make it to his eyes. They left an hour later. That evening I called Crandall and told him to prepare everything I'd asked him to prepare 3 weeks earlier. He said it was ready. I told him to bring it to the farm the following Saturday at 7 in the evening. I told him we would be having dinner. I invited my daughter and her husband for what I said was a family dinner to discuss the farm's future. I told them I had made some decisions and wanted to share them in person. They arrived at 7. My son-in-law was almost glowing. He thought he had finally gotten through to me. He thought the old man was ready to sell. I made pot roast, Beverly's recipe. I set the table the way she used to for important dinners. The good plates, the cloth napkins, candles. My son-in-law poured himself a glass of wine and complimented the place like he was already staging it for photographs. After we ate, I asked them to stay at the table. I went to the sideboard and got the folder Crandall had prepared. I said, "Before we talk about any sale or any transition, there are some things I need you to understand about what you've actually been negotiating for." My son-in-law smiled. He said, "Of course. What's on your mind?" I opened the folder. I said, "When you had the farm appraised, they valued the agricultural parcel and the structures. That number was roughly accurate for what they looked at." He nodded. I said, "What they didn't look at, what you didn't know to ask about, is everything else." I spread the documents on the table. I walked them through it item by item. The cooperative stake, the 2 rental properties in town, owned outright, generating consistent income. The investment trust Beverly and I had been building since 1987, professionally managed, never touched. The total picture. I pointed to the summary page Crandall had prepared. I said, "The farm and its associated holdings are worth approximately $3.8 million. Everything is held in a revocable trust with me as sole trustee. My daughter is listed as a contingent beneficiary at my discretion. That designation can be changed or removed at any time and for any reason." I looked at my son-in-law. I said, You have been negotiating to acquire assets you didn't understand, with information I gave you selectively to see exactly what you would do with it. The color left his face. My daughter said very quietly, "Dad," I said, "the appraisal firm you hired valued what I showed them. The assessment you arranged for my cognitive function cleared me completely. The development group you brought in offered me less than half of what this property is worth, and you knew the number was low because you work in real estate and you have access to comparable sales data." My son-in-law started to speak. I held up my hand. I said, "I also want you to know that Ohio is a one-party consent state. Any conversation I am a participant in, I can record legally. I have recordings going back to September." The silence in that kitchen was total. My son-in-law said, "Those are private conversations." I said, "They are conversations I was present for. I would encourage you to speak with your own attorney about what that means." My daughter looked at her husband. Something was happening in her face that I didn't have the heart to name. I gathered the folder. I said, "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to stop bringing development groups to my property. You are going to stop arranging assessments of my mental capacity. You are going to let me run my farm the way I have run it for 38 years. My son-in-law said, "You can't prove any intent here." I said, "Crandall believes I can. He also believes I have grounds for a civil action regarding the misrepresentation of your involvement with the Columbus Group. You told me you facilitated an introduction as a courtesy. What you actually did was negotiate a finder's fee contingent on the sale closing." His jaw tightened. I said, "I found the email." My daughter turned to look at him. He said, that's a mischaracterization." She said, "What email?" Neither of us answered her right away. She looked at me. She said, "Dad, what email?" I said, "Ask him." She did. He didn't answer in a way that explained anything. She asked again. He said it was complicated, and that he'd been trying to do something good for her family, and that I was a paranoid old man who had turned a routine conversation into some kind of conspiracy. She said, "Stop." He stopped. I reached into the folder and pulled out a single page and set it in front of her. It was the email, printed. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the table. She said, "I need some air." She got up and went out the back door. I could hear her on the porch. My son-in-law stared at the table. I said, "My daughter and I will work through what this means for our relationship. That is between us. What happens between the two of you is your business. But I want to be clear. This farm, this land, everything Beverly and I built, none of it will transfer to anyone under circumstances like these." I stood up. I said, "I have already updated the trust. If I die tomorrow, the farm transfers to an agricultural conservation easement. The land stays farmland in perpetuity. The house and structures go to the County Historical Preservation Board." He looked up. He said, "You can't do that." I said, "I did it 2 weeks ago." I walked to the back door and opened it. The night air came in, cool and smelling like fallen apples and wet earth. My daughter was standing at the fence looking at the dark outline of the orchard. I said, "I need you to leave now." He sat for another moment. Then he stood and picked up his jacket and went out the front door without speaking. I heard his car start. I heard it leave. I stood in the doorway and looked at my daughter at the fence for a while. Then I went out and stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since the day he walked the fence line before he came in for dinner." She turned to look at me. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to know whether you were part of it. And then when I knew you weren't, I needed to know whether you'd believe me. I wasn't sure which would be harder." She was quiet. Then she said, "I'm so sorry, Dad." I said, "You don't owe me an apology. You trusted someone you loved. That's not a thing to be sorry about." She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. The stars were out over the orchard. The old maple where she'd gotten married was just a shadow at the edge of the east field. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "Whatever you decide about your marriage, that's yours. I'll support you through it. As for this place, it stays. And when the time is right, and I trust that the time is right, it goes to you the way your mother intended." She nodded. She stayed a little longer and then she drove home. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Beverly's empty shelf where the green ledgers used to be. I said out loud to no one, or maybe to someone who couldn't answer back, "I kept the farm. I think I handled it right." The kitchen didn't answer. It never does. But I felt something in the quiet that I have felt before in rooms Beverly used to occupy. A kind of warmth that doesn't come from the furnace. That was 8 months ago. My son-in-law moved out of their house in February. My daughter filed in April. She told me he had been angling toward a divorce anyway, that he had been speaking with a financial attorney about what he might be entitled to in the event the farm was liquidated during the marriage. He had not gotten very far with that line of thinking once Crandall sent a letter outlining the terms of the trust and what had been documented over the preceding year. He did not contest anything. My daughter comes to the farm on Sunday mornings now. She brings coffee from the place in town she likes. She walks the orchard with me while I check the trees. She has started asking questions about the business. Real questions. The kind you ask when you want to understand something, not when you're building a case. Last Sunday, she picked up one of Beverly's old ledgers from the box I'd brought down from storage. She sat at the kitchen table and went through it page by page. She said, "Mom's handwriting is so neat." I said she was meticulous about everything. She said, "I want to learn how to do this. The real version. Not because of money. Because it's ours and I want to understand it." I looked at my daughter sitting at her mother's table with her mother's ledger open in front of her. I said, "Then I'll show you." She nodded. She turned the page. I went to put on more coffee. The orchard was out the kitchen window. Rows of trees bare in the winter light. The same rows my wife's grandfather planted. The same rows Beverly and I walked for 38 years. The same rows that will be there long after I am gone if I have anything to say about it. My son-in-law thought he was dealing with an old man who didn't know what he had. He thought grief made people blind and age made people easy. He had no idea what Beverly had built. He had no idea what she had trusted me to protect. He had no idea that every time I shook his hand and smiled, and offered him coffee and let him walk my fence line, I was watching and remembering and keeping a very careful count. Beverly used to say that the land remembers who tends it. I think she was right about that. She was right about most things. I keep my promises, she knew I would.